So this is the last section. This is part 5 for chapter 41. And so far, what have we looked at in chapter 41? We have looked at the merger, the consolidation, we have looked at the purchase of assets and the sale of stock, all as possible events that could happen upon the maturing of a corporate entity. Now we're going to take a look at the final phase of a corporate life, and that would be the dissolution or the termination of the corporation. So if there comes a point in a corporation's life where it no longer can operate profitably, or if it's a small business and there's lack of interest in continuing in the business, then the corporation needs to consider, and ultimately it may decide to terminate its existence. All right. So whenever we're looking at a termination of a corporation, just keep in mind that there are always going to be 2 steps, and these 2 steps are pretty similar to what we have talked about already when we looked at partnerships. All right. So these 2 steps, the 2 official terms for these 2 steps, they are dissolution and liquidation. So let's talk about dissolution first, and then we'll spend a few minutes on liquidation, right? So the dissolution, it's a formal decision, the formal disbanding of the corporation. And this can be done voluntarily, or it could be done involuntarily. So if you have a voluntary dissolution, and I've abbreviated it here to DISSO, okay? So dissolution, how does that happen? Well, it would be upon the action of it could be the shareholders, all right? If the shareholders unanimously take a step and agree to dissolve, then that's the first step that would have been completed. Or probably more likely in a big corporation, it'll be the board of directors that proposes, all right? It proposes the dissolution, and then it sets it for a meeting with the shareholders and asks the shareholders to approve the proposal to dissolve. Right? That's a voluntary dissolution. Right? Once we have this either proposal by the board approved by the shareholders, or the shareholders unanimously consent, then the matter goes to the Secretary of State's office. All right, articles of dissolution will be signed, and then ultimately they get filed with the Secretary of State's office. Right now, it doesn't have to happen that way, and on some occasions, the only way to dissolve will be by using the court system. And that's what we would call a judicial dissolution, and that would be an example of an involuntary dissolution. Probably what has precipitated the need for this judicial dissolution is that you have a corporation that is in disarray, all right? Its board is dysfunctional. The shareholders are not working together, all right? They can't make agreement about anything, all right? So one of the shareholders probably then goes to court and just lays all that out for the judge and asks as the remedy for the lawsuit, all right, would you just dissolve the corporation? Would you give us a court order to dissolve? Right? That's an involuntary dissolution. All right, and so the court would have to then listen to the evidence and make a decision about it. All right. But once we have this dissolution that has taken place, most likely through some act of the corporation itself on a voluntary basis, right? Then the corporation enters into a phase of liquidation, and that's the winding up phase. All right. What goes on during liquidation? There will be a sale of the corporate assets. The proceeds will be collected. Of course, there has to be an accounting done and the like, and then the proceeds will be used to pay off any creditors, and also if there's money left, to pay the shareholders, all right, to return the investment to the shareholders, and if there's any profit, to split that among the shareholders, all right. So whether you have a voluntary or you have an involuntary dissolution, you're going to need to kind of walk through this phase of liquidation. All right. So the difference between those two, the voluntary and the involuntary, is that when you have a voluntary dissolution, the board of directors acts as a trustee or acts as a set of trustees over the corporate assets. So they're charged, the directors are charged with handling the sale of the corporate assets and then also making sure the creditors get paid whatever they're due. When you have an involuntary dissolution, we change that process a little bit. Instead of letting the board act as trustees, the court will oversee it. And the court oversees the dissolution, the winding up, all right, by appointing a receiver. And a receiver is just an office of the court, kind of it's an appointed office by the court, all right? There's a person who is like an administrator or a manager. We call them receiver, though, in this case, who will handle the winding up. So go out and collect the corporate assets, what there might be, and then selling them off, using the proceeds to pay off the creditors. Right. So very similar how things take place, whether voluntary or involuntary. It's just a matter of which person is charged with the responsibilities. Right. So this finishes chapter 41 for us, and it also, pretty much winds up our discussion of corporations. And so you've gone through the full life cycle. You have learned, studied about how we create the corporation first. You've seen quite a bit about the operations. And now in this chapter, you've seen what can happen once we have a mature functioning corporation and what might happen in the end. All right. So please remember, you have vocabulary for this chapter. It's noted in the module. Just look for the list for chapter 41, and you are accountable for the terms on that list. All right, then I'm going to close the video, and I'll be seeing you when we start up with chapter 42.